July 1944. A sunken lane in the Norman countryside, somewhere south of the invasion beaches. The air is thick and green and still. On either side of the narrow track rise the hedgerows, not the neat garden hedges of a suburban street, but ancient earthen banks, taller than a man, centuries old, their crowns matted with trees and thorns, so dense a soldier cannot see 10 feet into them. Grinding up one of these banks is an American Sherman tank, its engine screaming as it tries to climb. And as its nose rises toward the sky, the belly of the tank, its thinnest, softest armor, lifts and points helplessly at the hedgerow across the field. Hidden in that far bank, a German soldier with a single shoulder-fired rocket is waiting for exactly this. He has been promised this moment. The terrain has handed it to him. A flash, a hollow bang. The Sherman shudders, stops, and begins to burn. This is the scene that had been repeating itself day after day across the whole American front in Normandy for the better part of 2 months. The greatest amphibious invasion in history had clawed its way ashore on June 6th, and then, a few miles inland, it had ground to a dead halt in a maze of dirt and hedge. This is not the story of the generals who planned the breakout or the bombers that darkened the sky over it. This is the story of a farm boy sergeant, a welding torch, and a pile of German scrap metal, and how a piece of improvised junk broke the deadlock that was strangling an entire army. The question that hung over Normandy in July 1944 should have had no simple answer. How does the most powerful army ever assembled, ashore in France with total control of the sky and an endless river of supplies behind it, get trapped and bled for weeks by nothing more than the shape of the land itself? To understand that, you have to understand the ground. The Norman farmers called it the bocage. For 1,000 years, the farmers of Normandy had marked the edges of their small fields with earthen banks, piling up soil and letting hedge and root grow over it until each field was ringed by a living wall. The result, seen from the air, was a vast green patchwork, thousands of small fields, each one boxed in on every side by these dense, impassable barriers. On a peaceful summer day, it is some of the prettiest farmland in Europe. In the summer of 1944, it became one of the deadliest defensive positions any army has ever been handed for free. Because for the German defender, every single one of those hedgerows was a ready-made fortress. He could dig his machine gun nests into the base of the bank, invisible from the field in front. He could cut firing slits through the roots. He could zero his weapons on the only gaps, the gates and lanes where the Americans would have to funnel through. And when the Americans took one field at a terrible cost, they would look up and see the next identical field in front of them, ringed by another identical wall, with another set of hidden guns waiting. Then another. Then another. The Germans did not have to hold a line. The land held it for them, field by field, hedge by hedge. For the German command, this was the one piece of good news in a bad summer. Their doctrine had always prized clever defense, and here, the very earth of France multiplied every soldier they had. A single machine gun and a handful of men could hold up an American company for hours. Officers told their troops that the bocage would bleed the Americans white, that it would take the invaders months to grind through it, and that every day of delay was a day for Germany to bring up reserves and seal the beachhead off for good. They were, for a while, entirely right. And the American tank, the weapon that was supposed to break through, was worse than useless here. Zoom in on the problem, because it is a cruel one. A Sherman could not smash through a hedgerow bank. The earth was too thick, and the tank would simply belly up onto the crown and stall. tracks spinning in the air. And the only way over was to climb, nose to the sky, which lifted its thin underside directly into the sights of every anti-tank weapon in the next hedge. The tank designed to lead the assault had become a coffin that could only advance by exposing its softest part to the enemy. Crews learned to dread the order to cross a hedgerow. Many of them died learning it. Consider what a single day in that maze cost. A Sherman crew, 5 young men sealed inside 30 tons of steel, would be ordered to take the next field. They knew what was coming. They would nose up to the bank, feel the tank tilt back as it began to climb, and in that instant, every man inside understood that the belly was rising into the crosshairs of whatever waited across the field. Some crews rolled the dice and were lucky. Some heard the hollow bang and felt the world turn to fire. The survivors would bail out into a field swept by machine gun fire, and the men who had watched from the hedge behind them would be ordered an hour later to try the very same thing at the very next field. It was a war measured not in miles, but in hedgerows, and the price of each one was paid in the same currency over and over. The infantry fared no better. A rifleman crawling along the base of one of these banks could not see the machine gun dug into the bank in front of him until it opened up at point-blank range. Officers began calling it the death of 1,000 cuts, no single great battle, just an endless series of small, vicious, identical fights, each one taking a few more men, none of them moving the front more than the width of a farmer's field. And behind the German line, the defenders were doing exactly what their commanders wanted, trading a little ground for a lot of American blood, buying time, and waiting for the invasion to exhaust itself against the oldest walls in Normandy. So the front froze, and a quiet catastrophe began to set in. The casualty lists climbed with nothing to show for them. American infantry divisions were being chewed apart, taking single fields. 100 men to advance a few hundred yards, only to face the same fight again at the next hedge. The commanders felt the ground slipping out from under their whole strategy. The invasion had been built on a promise of movement, of armored columns racing across France once they were ashore. Instead, the army was stuck in a slow, grinding meat grinder that looked more like the trenches of the First World War than the war of movement anyone had planned. Every day, trapped in the bocage, was a day the Germans could use to recover from the shock of the landings. If the deadlock held, the greatest invasion in history could still bleed to death a few miles from the beach where it had started. The generals knew it. Behind the front, engineers and officers were throwing every idea they had at the hedgerows. They tried blowing gaps with explosives, but it took enormous quantities of scarce demolition charges for every single bank, and it announced exactly where the tanks would come through. They tried bulldozer blades on tanks, but there were only a handful of bulldozers, far too few to matter. They tried simply driving over and watched their tanks die. Nothing worked at the scale the problem demanded. The best military minds in the theater were stumped by a wall of dirt and shrubbery. The answer would not come from a general. It came from a sergeant. His name was Curtis Culin, a young tank cavalry sergeant in the 2nd Armored Division. He was not an engineer or an inventor. He was one of the men actually living the nightmare, riding these tanks into these hedgerows, watching friends burn. And in one of those unglamorous conversations among tired men, trying to solve the thing that was killing them, someone, the story goes it was a fellow soldier, sometimes remembered as a Tennessee farmer in the ranks, half joked that what they really needed was a set of teeth on the front of the tank to just cut straight through the base of the hedge. Some of the men laughed. Culin didn't. He he took the idea seriously. Here's where the story turns and where the irony becomes almost too perfect. Culin needed strong steel, a lot of it, to build heavy cutting prongs that could bite into a packed earthen bank without bending. And scattered all over the invasion beaches behind him, rusting in the surf, was exactly that. Thousands of tons of heavy steel obstacles the Germans themselves had planted to stop the landings. Great welded crosses and angled bars of hardened steel, the beach defenses meant to rip the bottoms out of Allied landing craft. The Germans had forged that steel to keep the Americans out of France. Culin's crews cut it up, hauled it forward, and welded it to the noses of their Shermans as a set of thick, tusk-like blades. A tank fitted with these would no longer climb the bank and expose its belly. It would drive straight into the base of the hedgerow, the steel teeth biting in and holding the nose down, and shove through the earthen wall in a spray of dirt and roots, coming out the far side low, level, and with its gun already facing the enemy. The German fortress terrain had a door now, and the Americans could cut a new one wherever they pleased. When it was demonstrated, the effect was immediate and electric. A Sherman rigged with Culin's device rammed a hedgerow and burst clean through it. And the officers watching understood at once that the deadlock had just been broken by a sergeant with a welding torch. Word climbed the chain of command with unusual speed, and it reached the top. General Omar Bradley, commanding the American ground forces in Normandy, saw the device and grasped instantly what it meant. And he did something shrewd. Rather than use it piecemeal and let the Germans discover and adapt to it, he ordered it kept secret and produced in bulk. Welding teams working around the clock to fit hundreds of tanks with the cutters, quietly, so that when the Americans finally struck, they would strike everywhere at once, with a capability the enemy had never seen. The improvised tanks were nicknamed Rhinos, for the way they lowered their steel-horned heads and charged straight through the banks. Across Normandy, in hidden motor pools, a secret fleet of hedge-cutting tanks was being born out of German scrap. Now the two stories, the sergeant's welding torch and the general's grand plan, came together in a single operation. Its name was Cobra. In late July 1944, Bradley launched the breakout he had been waiting for. It opened not with tanks, but with the sky. Wave after wave of American heavy bombers, many hundreds of them, carpeted a narrow strip of the German line west of the town of St. Lo, churning the enemy positions into a moonscape of craters and stunned, buried men. It was a terrifying, imperfect, and costly bombardment. And then, into the shattered gap, the American army poured, and this time, the hedgerows did not stop them. The Rhino tanks put their heads down and cut straight through bank after bank, refusing to be funneled into the German kill zones, appearing in fields the defenders had thought sealed. The terrain that had held the Americans for 7 weeks suddenly meant nothing. Picture it now, from the German side, because this is the reckoning the whole story has been building toward. For weeks, the German defender had trusted the land the way a man trusts a locked door. Every hedgerow was his ally. He knew the Americans could only come through the gaps, and he had those gaps covered. And then, one summer day, the wall behind him simply opened. A Sherman came through the solid bank where no tank was supposed to be able to pass, low, level, gun leveled, in a place he had left undefended because the terrain itself was supposed to defend it. The fortress he had been handed for free had betrayed him in an afternoon. And when German officers examined the American tanks they managed to knock out or capture, they found the answer welded to their noses and could not quite believe it. Heavy steel teeth, crudely fabricated, bolted and welded onto the front of the tank. Cut, they would eventually realize, from the very beach obstacles the Wehrmacht had planted to stop the invasion in the first place. The German army had, in a sense, supplied the raw material for the device that unlocked its own defensive line. The steel meant to keep the Americans off the beaches had ended up cutting the road that let them off the beaches for good. That was the trap. Culin's welded teeth sprang open. And once it sprang, the reckoning at the top of the German command was swift and bitter. For the German generals in Normandy, the collapse after Cobra was not merely a lost battle. It was the loss of the one advantage they had been counting on to save the entire front. They had built their whole defensive plan on the assumption that the bocage would slow the Americans to a crawl, giving them the time to hold. When the American armor suddenly stopped being funneled into the gaps and began appearing everywhere at once, cutting through solid banks the defenders had never bothered to cover, that assumption died. And with it, died the German line in the west. Units that had held for weeks found themselves outflanked in hours, their carefully sighted machine guns firing at empty fields while tanks rolled through the hedges behind them. The land that had been their fortress became a trap with no walls left standing. The most galling part, for the professional soldiers who studied it afterward, was the simplicity of the thing that had undone them. Not a secret wonder weapon, not a stroke of high strategy. A set of scrap steel prongs, thought up by a sergeant, welded on in a field, and made from their own beach defenses. An army that took enormous pride in engineering brilliance had been beaten by a piece of battlefield improvisation so crude it could be built by any welding crew with a torch and a pile of German scrap. It was, in its own small way, the entire war in miniature, the perfectionist machine outdone by the improviser. The breakout became a flood. Once the American armor was through the bocage and into open country, the war of movement that had been promised on D-Day finally arrived. Columns raced south and then east. The German front in Normandy came apart, and within weeks, the Americans and their allies were sweeping across France toward Paris. The weeks of grinding stalemate gave way to one of the fastest advances of the entire war. The dam had broken, and a sergeant's welded scrap had helped break it. There is a temptation telling this story to make it sound tidy. One clever gadget wins a campaign. It was never that simple. The breakout took thousands of men, tons of bombs, and rivers of blood, and Culin's cutter was one piece among many. But it is a piece that matters because of what it represents. The German soldier in that hedgerow believed he was fighting a war of position, a contest of terrain and doctrine and clever defense, the kind of war his army had trained for generations to win. He was, in his own frame, correct. Field for field, the bocage should have held. What he had not accounted for was an enemy whose answer to a problem was not to outthink it in the classical sense, but to improvise a fix on the spot, mass produce it overnight, and change the physical rules of the battlefield. That was the American way of war in miniature. Not the perfect soldier, not the flawless plan, but the sergeant in the ranks who was allowed to have a good idea, and an army with the industrial reflexes to take that idea and bolt it onto 300 tanks before the enemy even knew it existed. The Germans had a word, roughly, for the contempt they first felt toward American improvisation. By August, in the wreckage of Normandy, that contempt had curdled into something closer to dread. Curtis Culin survived Normandy, though he would later be badly wounded in another forest, in another fight. He never claimed to be a genius, and he was always careful to share the credit for the idea. He was simply a young man in a tank who refused to accept that a wall of dirt and thorns was going to keep killing his friends, and who did something about it with the scrap he had on hand. The German army spent 7 weeks trusting the oldest hedgerows in France to win the battle for them. In the end, those same hedgerows were opened, with steel the Germans themselves had forged, welded to the nose of a tank, by a sergeant nobody in any headquarters had ever heard of. The land was never the weapon. The men who refused to be stopped by it were.